They expected hesitation, maybe even a scene. 16 years reduced to a sentence, delivered under fluorescent lights, in a room that suddenly felt too small for everything she had built. But she didn't argue, didn't defend, didn't even ask why. She stood up, removed her badge, and placed it on the table with the same precision she used to close multi-million-dollar deals. No emotions, no resistance, just completion. What no one in that room realized, what the CEO didn't see behind that quiet exit, was that her real work had never been in presentations or titles. It was in the structure, in the relationships, in the parts of the system that didn't move unless she allowed them to. And somewhere else, 7 minutes away, another office was about to notice. The conference room didn't change after she left. Same glass walls, same filtered light, same polished table reflecting faces that suddenly looked less certain than they had 5 minutes ago. But something subtle shifted. Not in the room itself, in the system that room depended on. At first, no one named it. The CEO leaned back, exhaled like a decision had just simplified his world. "Efficient," he said, almost to himself. "We've been overpaying for loyalty." A few quiet nods followed. Not agreement, alignment. The kind that appears when people sense the direction of power and move accordingly. HR closed the folder. Legal glanced at their watch. Someone typed something they wouldn't remember writing. Routine resumed. Or at least, it tried to, because across 3 floors and 2 continents, invisible threads began to tighten. At 9:12 a.m., an email sat unanswered. It wasn't flagged, it wasn't urgent, but it was from a partner tied to one of the $85 million deals she had structured, one that relied less on documentation and more on something harder to quantify. Trust. The message was short. "We heard about the change. Before we proceed, we need clarification on continuity." No one responded. Not because they didn't want to, but because no one quite knew how. Her notes existed. Her files were accessible. Her contracts were perfectly drafted. But the context, the living, breathing architecture behind each decision, wasn't written anywhere. And that was the first crack. At 9:26 a.m., finance tried to reconcile a scheduled release. Numbers aligned, approvals were in place. Still, something didn't move. A pause in the system. Not an error. Not a failure. Just resistance. The kind that doesn't trigger alarms, but slows everything down just enough to be noticed by the people who depend on momentum. "Check with ops," someone said. Ops checked with legal. Legal checked with compliance. Compliance opened a document, then stopped. There was a clause. Not hidden, not complex. Just conditional. And the condition referenced a validation pathway that had always been assumed, always handled, by her. At 9:41 a.m., the CEO asked a simple question. "Why is this taking longer than usual?" No one answered immediately, because the honest response wasn't technical. It wasn't about systems or documents or approvals. It was about absence, and absence is harder to quantify. Meanwhile, in a different building, quiet, controlled, and far less reactive, the rival CFO received a forwarded summary. Not dramatic, not urgent, just data. A deal log, $85 million in structured agreements, multi-layered, interdependent, clean. And in the margin, almost as an afterthought, one line, primary architect no longer with company. The CFO didn't react right away. He read, then reread, then paused. Not at the numbers, but at the pattern. Because deals like that don't come from process alone. They come from someone who understands where process ends and influence begins. He leaned back slightly, fingers still resting on the page. "Who approved this exit?" he asked. No one in his office answered immediately. But the question didn't need an answer. It already had direction. Back in the original building, small delays began to stack. Nothing critical, nothing visible on a dashboard, but enough to create friction. enough to shift tone, enough for someone, just one person, to quietly realize this wasn't a replacement problem, it was a dependency problem, and they had just removed the only person who understood how deep it went. At 10:03 a.m., the unanswered email was forwarded again, this time with a single addition: "We'll hold until we speak to her directly." That message didn't go to her. It went to the system she used to hold together. And for the first time that morning, someone felt it clearly. The silence wasn't empty. It was structural. At 10:07 a.m., the tone shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, but decisively. Because when one partner pauses, it's a delay. When two pause, it's a signal. The second message came from a different region, different team, same pattern. "We're reviewing internal alignment following the recent personnel change. Pending confirmation, execution is on hold." No accusation, no emotion, just controlled distance, the kind that professionals use when they sense instability, but haven't yet named it. Inside the company, the language was still optimistic. Temporary. Transition phase. Knowledge transfer in progress. Words designed to create continuity. But continuity isn't built on words. It's built on people who understand what isn't written down. At 10:19 a.m., compliance escalated quietly. Not to the CEO. To legal. Because the clause they had reopened, the one no one had paid attention to before, was no longer theoretical. It required discretionary validation. Not automated, not procedural. Interpretive. And interpretation, as it turned out, had always come from a single source. "Can we replicate her logic?" someone asked. A pause. Not because the answer was unknown, but because it was uncomfortable. "You can replicate her documentation," legal replied carefully. "But not her positioning." That word landed heavier than expected. Positioning. Because it meant the deals weren't just structured. They were negotiated in a way that aligned multiple moving interests at once. And without that alignment, everything technically still existed, but nothing moved. At 10:32 a.m., finance stopped trying to push the release, not out of failure, out of caution, because forcing execution without full contextual clarity risked something worse than delay. It risked misalignment. And in $85 million agreements, misalignment doesn't create noise. It creates loss. Meanwhile, in the rival office, the CFO had already moved past analysis. He wasn't interested in what she had done. He was interested in what would happen without her. "Pull external sentiment," he said. Within minutes, a quiet map formed. Two partners paused, one requesting direct confirmation, another delaying execution. No panic, no headlines, but enough to indicate a fracture line. And fractures, if timed correctly, become entry points. "Reach out," he said simply. "Directly?" someone asked. A brief pause, then a slight, almost imperceptible smile. "Discreetly." Back in her former company, the CEO still believed the situation was contained. Because on paper, everything was. Contracts intact, teams operational, systems running. But paper doesn't measure momentum. And momentum had already started to slow. At 10:48 a.m., a third message arrived. Shorter than the others. Colder. "We will await confirmation from the original architect before proceeding further." This one didn't get forwarded. It got read twice. Because now the pattern was undeniable. Someone finally said it out loud. "They're not asking about the deal." A pause. "They're asking about her." Silence settled differently this time. Not empty. Weighted. Because the realization wasn't about what had been lost. It was about what had been misunderstood. At 11:02 a.m., HR reopened the termination file. Not to reverse it. Not yet. Just to look again. Because suddenly, the decision didn't feel like a cost optimization. It felt like a structural removal. And somewhere else, her phone lit up. Unknown number, no name, no introduction, just timing. Perfect, deliberate timing. She looked at the screen and didn't rush to respond, because for the first time in a long while, the control wasn't in their hands. And this was only the beginning. If you've ever watched a system keep running, long after the person who made it work has left, pause here. Because this is the moment most people miss. Not the firing, not the silence in the room, not even the first delay. The real shift happens when others start adjusting their behavior, without being told. When partners hesitate, when decisions slow, when confidence quietly turns into caution, and no one says it out loud, but everyone feels it. Her phone rang a second time. Same number, no name, no urgency in the signal, just persistence. She looked at the screen for a moment longer than necessary, not out of hesitation, out of calibration, because timing, in her world, was never accidental. She let it ring twice more, then answered. Good morning. The voice on the other end was measured, controlled, the kind that doesn't introduce itself immediately because it assumes context will do that for it. She didn't reply right away. Silence again. But this time, it was hers. I believe you've had an eventful morning, he continued. A subtle choice of words. Not difficult, not unexpected. Eventful. She allowed the smallest pause. Define eventful. A shift, barely noticeable, but enough. Because now the conversation wasn't about her situation. It was about his positioning. In the rival office, the CFO stood near the window, overlooking a city that moved with quiet precision. He wasn't pacing, wasn't selling, he was aligning. We've been reviewing a series of agreements, he said. Structured, interdependent, unusually, resilient. She said nothing. Not because she had nothing to say, because she knew exactly what he was doing. He wasn't offering a job. He was validating a pattern. Those structures don't fail easily, he continued, unless the architecture behind them is removed. A pause. Then, deliberate, clean. And it seems someone just made that decision for you. Back in her former company, tension had changed shape. It was no longer about delays. It was about interpretation. Because now, every paused deal carried a question no system could answer. Was this designed to move without her? And no one could confidently say yes. At 11:18 a.m., legal requested an internal review, not public, not formal, just contained. Because they needed to understand something that documentation couldn't explain. Where exactly did her influence end? And the answer, slowly, uncomfortably, was beginning to surface. It didn't. Tell me something, the CFO said, his tone still even. If you were to step into a new structure, what would you prioritize first? Not salary, not title, structure. She almost smiled, because that question revealed more than any offer could. It meant he understood. Not just what she did, but how she thought. Across town, the CEO finally stopped calling it a transition, because by now, 3 partners had paused, 2 had requested direct confirmation, and 1, quietly but definitively, had started exploring alternatives. Not leaving, not yet, but looking. And in high-value environments, looking is the beginning of movement. Back on the call, she shifted slightly. Not physically, strategically. Stability, she said. One word, no explanation, but enough. Because in her language, stability didn't mean safety. It meant control over variables others didn't even see. The CFO nodded, though she couldn't see it. Good, he said. A brief pause. Then, without emphasis, without theatrics, we're prepared to offer double. Silence followed. Not shocked, not dramatic. Just precise. Because the number wasn't the point. The timing was. At 11:26 a.m., her former company attempted to re-engage the first partner. Carefully worded. Confident tone. But something had already shifted. Because now the question wasn't, can you execute the deal? It was, can you execute it without her? And that's a different conversation. She looked out the window. Different building, different view. But the same principle applied. Systems don't collapse instantly, they reveal themselves. Send the structure, she said calmly. Not acceptance, not refusal, just the next move. In the rival office, that was enough, because offers can be negotiated. But alignment? That's either there, or it isn't. And back in the original building, for the first time that day, someone said the only question that actually mattered. Do we still have access to her? Silence answered. But this time it was different. Heavier. And very expensive. At 11:43 a.m., the silence inside her former company stopped being passive. It became intentional. The first escalation didn't come from the CEO. It came from finance. Because numbers don't tolerate uncertainty for long. We're holding $18 million in scheduled movement, someone said, voice controlled but tighter than before. If this extends, we start affecting downstream obligations. No panic. But the language had changed, from process to impact. Legal followed almost immediately. The partner clauses are now being interpreted conservatively, they added. Without her validation pattern, we're exposed to conditional ambiguity. That wasn't a technical issue, that was risk. And risk, at that scale, doesn't stay theoretical. The CEO didn't respond right away, not because he didn't understand, but because, for the first time, the situation wasn't aligning with his decision. And that creates a different kind of pause. At 11:51 a.m., HR suggested outreach, carefully phrased. Perhaps a transitional consultation. Temporary, of course. Temporary. The word hung in the air with quiet irony, because everyone in that room now understood. Nothing about her role had ever been temporary. Meanwhile, across the city, her inbox updated. One message. Clean subject line. Proposed structure. No excess language, no persuasion, just a document. She opened it, and immediately saw the difference. Not in compensation, though it was exactly as stated. Double. But in architecture. Clear authority boundaries. Direct partner alignment. No fragmented validation layers. No need to translate decisions across departments. It wasn't just an offer. It was an environment built to move. Back in her former company, the second partner sent an update. Short, measured, final in tone. Given current uncertainty, we are reallocating internal focus. We will revisit alignment pending structural clarity. That wasn't a delay. That was withdrawal. The room didn't react immediately, because everyone understood what that meant, without needing it explained. At 12:04 p.m., the CEO finally spoke. Get her on the phone. Direct, simple, but already late. No one moved instantly, because now the question wasn't how to reach her. It was what to say when they did. Offer retention, someone suggested. Frame it as strategic continuity. Position it as leadership realignment. The language came quickly, polished, professional, and completely disconnected from the reality they were now facing. Because this wasn't about retention, it was about regaining control they didn't realize they had lost. Across town, she read the final page of the proposal. One section stood out. Not highlighted, not emphasized. Just precise. Full operational authority over deal architecture and partner alignment. No translation needed. No negotiation implied. Her phone buzzed again. This time, not unknown. Her former company. She didn't answer immediately. Again. Not out of hesitation. Out of leverage. Because leverage isn't built in the moment you speak. It's built in the moment you choose not to. At 12:11 p.m., inside that glass-walled room, something finally became clear to everyone present. They hadn't just removed a role. They had removed the point of coherence in a system built on moving parts. And now, everything was still there, but nothing aligned. The call kept ringing, once, twice, 3 times. No answer. She closed the document, looked at the city again, then, quietly, placed the phone face down. Because for the first time in 16 years, the system wasn't waiting on her. They were. At 12:19 p.m., the system reached a point it couldn't disguise anymore. Not a collapse, not yet, but exposure. The dashboard still looked stable, green indicators, active workflows, no alerts. But behind that surface, movement had slowed to something almost unrecognizable. Approvals paused mid-chain, partners silent, decisions deferred. Not because the system was broken, because it no longer knew how to decide without her. In the conference room, no one was using the language from earlier. No more optimization, no more efficiency. Now it was, "How fast can we stabilize this?" And no one answered with confidence. At 12:27 p.m., the CEO finally understood the mistake. Not intellectually, structurally, because this wasn't about losing an employee. It was about removing the integrator, the one point where strategy, trust, timing, and execution converged into something that actually moved. And without that point, everything else became fragments. "Call her again," he said, quieter this time. Across the city, her phone lit up once more. She glanced at it, recognized the number, let it ring. Not to make a point, to define one. Back in the rival office, the CFO received confirmation. Document delivered, awaiting response. He nodded slightly. No urgency, because this wasn't a race anymore. It was a transition already in motion. "Prepare integration plan," he said. Quietly. At 12:34 p.m., the third partner sent their update. No hesitation, no soft language. "We are suspending further engagement pending reevaluation of execution capability." That was it. No ambiguity left. Inside the company, the effect was immediate, not visible on screens, but felt. Because now the question wasn't about delays, it was about credibility. Legal stopped drafting responses. Finance stopped forecasting timelines. Operations stopped pushing. Because pushing without alignment would only accelerate the problem. And for the first time that day, no one was trying to fix it. They were trying to understand how it had been held together in the first place. At 12:41 p.m., HR finally said what had been avoided all morning. "We need her back." Not as suggestion, as conclusion. The CEO didn't respond, because by now, he understood something more difficult than the initial decision. Getting her back wasn't the same as bringing her back. Across town, she picked up the phone, not to answer, just to hold it for a second, feel the weight of it. Then she set it down again. Because timing wasn't about reaction, it was about position. She reopened the proposal, read one line again, full operational authority, no fragmentation, no translation, no dependency on misaligned layers. She exhaled slowly. Not relief. Recognition. Because what had just happened wasn't loss. It was clarification of value, of structure, of where she actually belonged in systems like this. At 12:49 p.m., she typed a single message, short, precise. "Proceed." In the rival office, no one reacted loudly. No celebration, no rush, just movement. Clean, coordinated, expected. Back in her former company, the phone stopped ringing. Not because they stopped calling, because somewhere, instinctively, they understood. The system hadn't collapsed. It had shifted, and the center of that system was no longer theirs. By the end of the day, reports would be written, explanations drafted, strategies reconsidered. But none of that would change the one thing that actually mattered. The moment they removed what they didn't understand was the moment everything else started to reveal its real cost. And this time, there was no silence left to hide it.